I'd like to welcome Bruce up and thank Bruce for being here this evening.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have you pass around copies of this book. I have 3 of them to give away. It's the book I'm speaking from. And I'm happy to say that Selena and her parents are some of the most lovely hosts I've had on this 20-city book tour. They have given me their home, which is exceptional, in 8 books. It's never happened to me before, except once in Norway, where they were trying to better the Swedes, I think. So with great generosity, Selena has shown me Australia. And what I want to talk about today is people, processes, and product. And I believe that sustainability is something we need to compete on. Just like in the 19th century, industrialism learned how to compete on price and distribution. In the 20th century, the great thinkers Deming and Duran added the idea of competing on a third variable, namely quality. But I think in a world of 7 billion souls, we need to compete on price, quality, distribution, and social needs. And by social needs, I will talk to you about changing mobility in the project that we did for Toyota in the early days of this new century. We worked for Toyota on the hybrid powertrain, and I will talk about that, how we need to change the nature of housing, the nature of jets, and about how sustainability boils down to 2 kinds of stories, I believe, that I want to start this talk on, and then acknowledge my daughter, who's in the audience somewhere. There she is. Colette helped put together this presentation. She's my 15-year-old daughter from New York. So thank you, Colette, for helping me put this together. This is a new presentation called Prezi, so it's a lot more new generation that Colette knew about. So the 2 things that I'm going to try and convey to you are related to 2 different stories that I start this talk with. The first is, for 18 years, I've advised a man that I write about in Doing More with Less, in the chapter called Scarcity and Creativity. And this man is, some of his designs, Pat Mahoney's designs, are in the Smithsonian Institute in the States. He makes value and money out of waste. And so he has designed some of the most sophisticated integrated solid waste management systems in the world. And so the first story I want to tell you about is Pat, and the second story I want to tell you about is my daughter Colette. Pat is now approaching 70, and he is an emblem of where industrialism had to go last century. So I'll tell you a little bit about a $1.2 billion project we just finished groundbreaking in Baltimore Harbor in New York, in Maryland, right? So hopefully some of you will know that I'm the type of speaker that really encourages interaction. And so don't think that I favor hearing myself. I really just want to shape the 2 stories and learn from you. So Pat is a very typical stingy businessman, and actually of the $1.2 billion only spent $60 million of his own. And so the story I want to tell you is about how to design things using other people's money and social needs in mind. So I had worked for several years for a chemical company called FMC, and they had made many World War II munitions to support the World War. And so I knew of the contaminated spaces they had spread around the world, and Baltimore Harbor was one of the worst. However, the contamination was predictable. It wasn't like you have in some traces in Sydney from Dow, Agent Orange remnant. This was a simpler series of chlorinated hydrocarbons that I had written a book about. And so the first thing we had to do in all design questions is find the right location. And so we found, and leased for 100 years, contaminated property in Baltimore Harbor. You can go to Energy Answers Wales.com to watch a video on this Fairfield renewable energy facility I'm telling you about. It's a beautiful design, actually, and the first in America to receive more than $60 million in matching from the Obama administration for the stimulus money that Obama was giving for innovation, and then hundreds of millions for renewable energy credits. It's the first time, at least in America and perhaps in the world, where a system could be designed whereby processed waste that is normally destined for a landfill is qualified as renewable BTU sources. So that's the nature of the project. But I want to start with this one so you could see how competing on sustainability is always going to involve multiple conflicted organizations. And my job is to balance the negativities, right, as a facilitator and conceiver of these changes. And so FMC had a long liability that lasted hundreds of years. And so their motive to coming to the table was to reduce their costs of operations and maintenance under two laws that we knew fairly well called RCRA and CERCLA. CERCLA is the American Superfund. That would be, for example, modeling the laws by which you're going to spend $6 billion here in Sydney on the new coastal restoration project. Selena, remind me the name of it. You introduced me to the people. She's out. Barango, right. We were there 2 days ago and met some of those developers. So it's a brownfield site, right? It's a contaminated site. So FMC was motivated to try and do something with lands that they were going to have to pump and treat for 100 years because it's contaminated. Pat Mahoney was motivated by the desire to do something as an innovator and also as a capitalist who believes that the world is full of so much waste that he has to find new value in waste. The community stakeholders that we worked with were motivated because the harbor had become economically isolated due to the contamination, and the neighborhoods were hurting. And we put on last October an event where the governor of Maryland was there, the mayor of Baltimore, a Afro-American woman very much like Michelle Obama. We were going to have the president, but instead the Republican governor chose to come because he was running for re-election. The head of the U.S. Steelworkers Association, because there were 800 new jobs for welders and steam workers, and the environmental groups were there. And so I write about it in Doing More with Less as a model that sustainability is very much about business alliances. It's very much about blending government enabling needs, right, the monies from the Obama administration, with capitalist needs, which normally one wouldn't focus on processed waste, right? It also involves listening to the negativities of the project, where the stakeholders said, we're very tired of trucks in our neighborhood. And that's why the harbor we're barging in the processed waste from the Northeast. And so we're solving waste problems in Washington, Baltimore, and some corridors of the Northeast. Okay, so that's the first image to keep in mind, where there is sustainability is about balancing negativities. Any questions about that before I proceed? Sustainability is also about understanding enough of the rules and how rules shape markets so that you can influence the flow of money and people in new positive directions. And so in this particular case, a man that had come to trust me across 18 years knew that there was a waste problem in the Northeast of America. He knew that Obama wanted innovation, and so he hired us to help conceive this project. He's doing the same now in Puerto Rico, which is, many island economies have a huge waste problem. So the second story, before I start going through my slides, has to do with my daughter. And it is my hope that someday, perhaps 15 or 20 years from now, when I'm 77, my daughter would inherit the company that I spent 30 years creating. And I think she has the potential to do that, and that's why she travels with me before college to learn from folks like you and to help get mentored. I started my company in 1981. It now has some of the most premier environmental attorneys in America. folks like Ken Strassner, Steve Percy. Denny was the top product liability attorney for GM. I know that GM is here with Holden. Kimberly Clark's top attorney was Ken Strassner. He's now in my firm. We also have some of the best engineers and also some of the best strategists, at least in my thinking. And so we've now reached a point where we're very committed to the idea that rules change too slowly, money flows favor risk too easily, and people can be more aggressive on change than they know. And so doing more with less is my vision statement, my personal narrative on how to realign money, people, and rules to enhance the search for innovation of a Pat Mahoney type. Now, the reason why I'm focusing a little bit on Colette and the future, Pat's 70. I think you know that if you go back 70 years in the history of consumption, Pat's grandfather consumed a fifth of what Pat does in his lifestyle, in his lifetime. It's most probable that when you have 7 billion souls on Earth, they still will want to at least consume at the level of Pat Mahoney and myself, or maybe more, right? And so the thing that I'm trying to project now is some principles that will allow us to develop the arts of competitive frugality to last the next 65 years. I can't see further than that. I think that what it takes is good corporate governance. It takes commitment. It takes you as citizens of the world having oversight on your lifestyle, on your buying patterns, and on the products you prefer. And it also involves some new radical forms of design that are as radical as that Pat Mahoney one I started out with. This is what's going to liberate cooperation and teams of leaders. Let me open up and ask, has anyone heard this term of teams of leaders before? It's a military term that I'd like to share with you. And it's so amazing to me. One of the benefits of writing Doing More with Less is I was invited to be a keynote at a place opposite of Farnham Castle where I met Selena. And this was military generals. And they had read about how Doing More with Less hit the New York Times bestseller list, and they said, give this guy a chance. And I need to report to you that General Honore, who's the general who excavated 16,000 citizens from Hurricane Katrina and broke 3 or 4 federal laws deliberately in the process. If you have a pregnant woman on the top of a flooding building with 2 babies, you're not going to ask her for a second visual ID. All right? So Honore taught me the power of urgency. There was another general who had worked a lot of the time in the fall of the Berlin Wall on integration of all of the teams. So teams of leaders, which I recommend you Google and research, is the American military's new way of realizing that the wars of the future are going to be about resources. They're going to be about energy and the biological deployment of energy. They're going to be about clean water, and it's going to be about safe food. So I found it astonishing being invited into this Pentagon event where these 3-star generals were actually saying the same principles and the same stakeholders that I wish to share to you. And I need to let you know that I am not a person who favors the military. I am not a person who favors a warlike situation. I believe, as you'll see in my talk, the opposite. So I want to start today talking about living together, working together, achieving together as the means of design sustainability. And I want to thank Selena Griffith and Kate Carruthers, who I just met, for inviting me here. So the key stakeholder and the key take-home issues. I believe in starting a talk with stories and bottom lines and then getting into the detail. I think that in our swift and severe new professionally global world, where the folks of Australia need to compete against the folks not only in the Fiji Islands, but also in Europe and North America and Canada and Asia in particular, that the new mantra of this new century is doing more with less is success. If you can build a company with less people, less materials, and less mistakes, it will be successful. And so a lot of what I'm talking to you about is this mantra, doing more with less. I think the medical profession and the other professions that I think a lot about need to be seen as more inventive and more frugal at the same time. That groups shape modern innovation paths. And so one of the things my talk is trying to help you think through is that Steve Jobs-like individuals are rare and are not the model of true innovation. So while the world wants to celebrate someone on the top of a Christmas tree, like Steve Jobs, or wants to celebrate the notion of a Bill Gates as the prime mover of Microsoft, when you look at Microsoft Australia, you know that can't be true, right? So that what I want to remind us of is the power of groups in realigning money, people, and roles. I also today want to talk about how the biggest job of innovation today requires savings in energy, human motion, and materials. And of course, this is what the bottom line of good design is all about. If you can make a home with more recycled content and less energy consumption, if you can make a car that's even better than the Prius. When we designed the Prius, we knew it was an intermediate step in a world questing for mobility, right? So these are the kinds of companies that my firm has worked for. 40 of them are the largest multinationals in the world. I don't want you to focus on this any more than to say that these are some of the largest polluters in the world that we're trying to change. Dow, DuPont, Suncor Energy. I'm particularly proud that we've worked for 7 years. I want to tell you some stories about them. These are the kinds of companies that are equivalent to GM, Holden, Toyota here in Australia, or on the energy side, BHP, Xstrata. These are equivalent to, in the food space, the way Woolworths and Kohl's is using the same type of Walmart formula to dominate regional markets. So the lessons that I'm taking from Australia and trying to share with Australia, I derived from working for these companies. Do they always like working with me? No. The fact that they hire someone like me is a good sign, because they know that I'm employed with my lawyers to keep them out of penalties and jails, but also to change their products and their firms for a world of 7 billion souls. So if you looked at my last 8 books over the last 30 years when I incorporated, I've written books about each of those steps up the chart. The main thing I want you to take away today is that most of the world in the 1970s space, when I started, was about waste containment and recovery systems, right? And they were all end of the pipe in design, and they were all stimulated by regulation, not market conditions. Then by the 1990s, many people were involved in management systems. And I see that some of you are management consultants here. Can I have a hand of how many management consultants are here? Yes, Carruthers. Yes. I need to learn your name again. Your name? Janine, okay. And you're two in front of Janine.
Jason and Caroline.
Caroline and you. Yep. So we know that in the 1990s, ISO management systems become popular, global management systems, dashboards to track performance, etc. I think around the year 2000, when I was writing my books called Environmental Management Systems, when I was writing my book, Corporate Environmental Strategy, corporate social responsibility is created. Now, if we need to get to there by the next 20 years, you can see that we're beginning the roller coaster kind of fast, right? And so today I want to focus on what I think is real for today as a state-of-the-art debate, and this is called social response product development. I think we're at a turning point where we can either choose despair and be overwhelmed by the climate change challenge, to be overwhelmed by the reality that oil is on a 4.4% annual decline in the last 3 years, Or we can look at the creative aspects of human imagination and get into what I'm calling the stakeholder value creation focus. And before I define that, I want to get to the bottom line. I think social innovation networks are going to be the primary force to allow this change to jump to the higher level, because society is demanding this change, not the corporations that I work for. All right, so I want to try and convey what this change is about before I go on. Throughout business school, and I created my own corporation, it's all balanced. Classical business is balanced on a shareholder value creation focus. It's balanced on risk management tools, compliance, asset recovery, asset integrity. It's the way in which corporations work, and it's the way in which stock value is ascertained. So I gave you a book of mine. A dozen of you got a book called The Surprising Solution, where that's the first time I went around the world looking at money valuation models, like Dow Jones SAM and Innovest. And in those chapters, I predicted that soon, perhaps in the first or second decade of this new century, a new stakeholder value creation focus had to be. And this is what Selena means when I'm saying I'm trying to teach the companies to not only listen to stakeholders, but to also respond to them. So right now, the state of stakeholder engagement is a half-full cup, where most of the talented people who do this work are good at listening, but not necessarily changing the company so that it could respond with codes of best practice superior to existing law that enable them to capture the wind of future markets in a more reliable way. So stakeholder value creation is about sustainable enterprises. It's about value creation. It's about making the most of icon products. So every change agenda that I have, I try and find a hybrid powertrain within a Toyota in order to change all of Toyota. I don't want to just change that division of Toyota. I want to change the way they think about the near future. See what I mean? And that's what icon products are. We worked for the last 5 years for Warren Buffett, for a firm called Shaw Industries. When you looked at any Warren Buffett holdings, that billionaire is very good at shareholder value creation. He's very good at the conventional balance sheet of the 10K and the 10Q and all the securities requirements at FTSE or Australia or whatever. However, he's beginning to see that integrity brands matter, social response capitalism is real, and aligning profit with people and planet will give you more wind in your sail over time. And so he's enabled my firm to help Shaw Industries, one of his holdings, reduce their energy consumption from $320 million a year, 14% through these kinds of innovation routes that I'm talking to you about. He's enabled us to replace, in their premier product families of carpets, this is the world's largest maker of carpet, 26% recycled content in their premier products. Now, as you can imagine, people are product champions and are addicted to their products. They're also addicted to their families. It's a very strong addiction. So to make a 26% recycled content change was very radical. We had to convince them to buy an obsolete $100 million Honeywell facility to recycle nylon 6. These are not easy changes, but these are the changes of the future. Any questions about stakeholder value creation before I move on? Selena?
I think I'd like you to expand a little bit on delivering relevant responses to the research that you're doing when you're talking to your stakeholders.
Say that again so that I...
When we listen to our stakeholders, which we're good at doing, how do we change, or how do we affect relevant changes for them from the information that we've garnered from listening to them?
Okay, then this is a perfect feed into this slide. I believe that if you're working for a multinational, you're within a mansion, within a corporate mansion with a very large stairwell, and that most of the windows to that mansion look one way. To the outside world, it looks like a mirror that's a reflective mirror, right? And in the basement are all the horrible liabilities and broken products and faulted things, and high up at the top are the well-paid executives, and there's a stairwell. The first way to listen as a corporation is to change the staff, title, and functions of your people. And so I believe that in the end, the corporations that I work for need to appoint sustainability champions. And most of my 3-year assignments for companies like FMC or Shore Industries or now Ecolabs are where we're going to tell the senior management, we're going to help facilitate how they identify the top 20 sustainability champions within their firm. We're going to then establish a monthly Sustainability and Growth Council in which these people teach themselves to be agents of change. And we're going to make sure that those top 20 people are respected by senior management by making sure that one of the top 4 profit and loss people chair this committee. We have a protocol by which we change the thinking of these people so they see integration between procurement, product design, product delivery, manufacture, and ultimate disposal of the product. So the way we do this is to come up with process changes. Now, deliberately in the back of that image, so this is a typical human resource image. In this, does anybody happen to know what's going on in that image, the middle image? Because I think it might be relevant to Australia soon. Yes, it's a Caterpillar mining truck. Caterpillar is one of our corporate affiliates. This thing is bigger than this building, and what it's mining is oil sands in Canada. Suncor Energy, which is one of our clients, is the world's largest exploiter of that proven reserve. It is at the very heart of process change. It is the biggest sustainability challenge in the world right now because America, which as you know is a huge importer of oil, is already importing 17% of its oil from oil sands. Oil sands are dirtier to produce. They have a larger climate change impact. And in fact, the reason why the world is moving towards that is because it's a proven reserve. So it's very different than, say, what BP is suffering right now, another one of our corporate affiliates. BP's profits are down 34% in the last 90 days. You might have read in yesterday's paper, because they don't have the same amount of proven reserve that they used to have. Exxon, Total, all of them are suffering the fault of not finding oil as rapidly as they had since World War II. This is reality, right? And so what I'm trying to do in this particular slide tries to bring home the negativity of the space that I work in as a change agent. So in order to change a Caterpillar and change a Suncor, Suncor owns 51% of all of the reserves of oil sands for the next 100 years. So it's very similar to the FMC story I started. In order to change them, to develop a process change, a code of best practices in which they're doing more superior work than just getting oil at a profitable rate, right? We had to do 2 process changes, and I want to tell you about them before I move on. The first is we had to create a $400 million per year innovation alliance that you can read about. It's called COSIA. Interestingly enough, it sounds so much like COFA, but COSIA is the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. And my firm had to play a role in getting the 12 CEOs who own the future of this kind of oil to agree on sharing intellectual property for innovation. The reason why we decided to attack this issue 2 years ago passionately, COSIA, we worked on it for 4 years, and COSIA was announced last March. And we're bringing COSIA to Washington, D.C. on December, the second week of December for the first time. COSIA is going to advocate 7 codes of best practice improvement. The first is the most dramatic, where in the old days of creating oil sands, you would create these tailing ponds that were so horrendous that you can see them from outer space. These tailing ponds were so impactful that it was changing the nature of the Aboriginal people there. And so through intellectual property and engineering innovation, Suncor is now sharing an invention with the other 11 companies that allows the future of that type of activity to operate with tailing ponds that are recoverable within a year rather than within 35 years, saving roughly $1.4 billion Canadian per year in operational costs, right? So we did this through process innovation by getting 12 people who happen to be the CEOs of the future of that lease, right, to agree on tailings recovery. Now, I am a pragmatist. I need to let you know that we're working very hard on making progress in greenhouse gases on this, that we haven't yet achieved the agreements that I want between the 12 firms, that they see me as a thorn in their side. But the good thing is they're allowing us to create a 30-person stakeholder engagement advisory council. So right now we're working on the governance structure to give these 30 people power over these 12 CEOs. And these 30 people will be people like Steve Esposito of DC, who's the president of Resolve, or the leading scientists at Natural Resource Defense Council, or the leading people of Environmental Defense Fund, so, or former ambassadors to Canada. So my firm gets the chance to advise these 12 CEOs on what those 30 stakeholders should be. And the governance protocol, another process change. See what I mean? Now, the 5 other areas we're working on: water conservation, we're making progress on. Particulate management, we're making progress on. Land stewardship, we're making progress on. There's 7 of them. And so in the end, sustainability is about negotiating codes of best practice in advance of existing law so that the corporations tell each other what can be done before the public even knows how to ask the question. Now that's very Orwellian, but that is actually the state of the art, in the sense that when you look at where we're getting our oil in Australia, we can predict that much of the oil and natural gas will come from deep rock, right? Similar codes of best practice need to be evolved by your stakeholders in Australia in order to make sure that your water is protected from this inevitability, right? So these are the types of issues I work on. I hope this is the beginning of a dialogue so that we can continue. In the end, the most sacred thing is product, right? In a capitalist system, I wish I could say that the most sacred thing were people. That's the way I try and run my firm, right? That's why I have some incredible stories of loyalty in this new book. I would wish in a better world, like the world conceived by Candide and Voltaire, that processes were ever large enough to change the world, but I don't really think they are. In the end, we need to design products that are going to be the answer to the future. But we need to look at innovation routes in all 3 of those to be change agents. Any questions about that before I go on? Yes, sir.
Just a question on the innovation, knowledge sharing here. I mean, the key driver for these organizations is obviously liability going forward. It's not altruism. So how do you do that in the Australian market where liability is not as mature as in the US?
Great question. Without a doubt, regulation is the floor of the mansion, and without a doubt, the people who rise up on the stairwell in the mansion are people that can often contain liability and outsmart regulation faster than others, right? And so the way I think of this predicament, Hans, is that we need to find ways to blow out the reflective windows of the multinationals so that more people can look in, right? And that is beginning to happen in some of the financial disclosure requirement rules, like Sarbanes-Oxley. It's also starting to happen in international accounting markets. There's some accountants here. So that every time you take the mansion and begin to look in, you can see what they're actually doing as they're rising up the stairwell, and you can create some path of change. I think Hans is dealing with the reality that rules are not as rigorous in all places of the world, and the power of the attorney is different. Very different, say, in Asia than in the United States. Nonetheless, there are firms like Toyota that want to have the license to grow in an age of sustainability throughout the whole world. And that's why Toyota is strong, say, in Australia. What I focus on, Hans, is getting into the corporate mansions where you can create a precedent of superior behavior so that the environmental community can guilt all the others to jump that high. And that actually peer pressure and collective guilt is a better agent of change. So I dedicate my life and my staff inside the mansion, but hopefully by publishing those examples, many others can cause more positive change. So it is a predicament, and I think it's a great question. When liability lags, it's very difficult to get to stakeholder engagement. It's very difficult to make a major innovation like the ones that we need. Yes, Kate.
Isn't one of the problems that we face, that regulation is backward-looking, and it's only the last crisis that occurred, not the next one? Creation of the next one often.
I'm with you, Kate. And let's jump ahead, and I think this is the best way to answer it. If you take Kate's very penetrating and Hans's very penetrating, honest reality that regulation is just the ground floor, we then have to ask, what are the levers large enough to change a corporation if regulation is always too reactive and slow? And the answer are, what I tell my staff is the 3 R's. Reporting, reputation, and revenue. Now, thank God for financial disclosure reporting requirements, where just in the last 6 years, there's 60 chaps in London called the Carbon Disclosure Project. I don't know if any of you have heard of CDP, all right? So CDP came up with the great idea. I know their CEO, Paul Simpson. I know that he's really just 40 young computers in London, right? They're not massive. They have created a huge amount of corporate change by requiring people to disclose what their carbon inventory, what their carbon digest is, in advance of the law, right? So these are 40 kids who are sharp with computers creating massive change through reporting. I first had that insight as a ground for hope beyond regulation when I was on the Environmental Protection Agency's executive committee and working for Vice President Al Gore on a White House council. And we came up with this notion of disclosure being more powerful than regulation. And we did it under a law called TSCA, which is the Toxic Substance Control Act. And there was a section in the law called Section 313, where when I talked to some senators about it, they got really hot under their collars. They realized that if you found a way where the government told the corporate mansion to open its window a little bit and let some light in, that this was going to create more change than if the US EPA spent decades trying to regulate toxics, all right? This is truly the state of the art around the world. So reporting change is mission critical. Stakeholders should ask hard questions about all corporate reports, and they should ask for more information rather than less. That is a huge change in the last 10 years. In a world in which governments are retreating due to austerity budgets, regulation will slow even more. And in that horrible reality, it's important that these progressives who are very smart on reporting requirements. So one of my students, who I found at Harvard, Amy Muska O'Brien, just tell you about her a little bit so you can see how the design of information plays a role in all of this. I found her at Harvard as a scientist. She came to study management with me at an engineering school. And then she managed the money for the Lutheran Church. And then she tried to create the Global Reporting Management Initiative, GRI. I don't know if any of you have heard of GRI, right? It's relevant to Australia. She was one of the 20 founders of GRI, and it's become a science and tens of thousands of people involved. She understands that if you just unlock the window a little bit and let people look in, you can make massive change. So reporting is the first of the R beyond regulation. Reputation is incredible. I'm going to just give you a trick that I use all the time. So say there's 109 utilities that are privately held in America, and I've now worked for 17 of them. And right now, for the next 10 years, I could see in Australia that the government has begun to privatize electricity in regional agreements, correct? And so for 10, 15 years, there'll be all kinds of fights about rules and market stability on how you make electricity in this area of the world, right? Eventually, 50 to 100 entities will emerge, either as privately owned utilities or publicly owned, or hybrid, right? In America, we have 109. The Department of Defense asked me a question on one contract: how do you modernize those guys, right? So I worked for 3 years on modernizing utilities. What I came away from that experience was reputation is a huge agent of change. So that supposing you have a $60 billion utility like DTE, Detroit Edison, which I now work for, and it took me 5 years to get them to invest $2.2 billion in renewable energy. What motivates their senior management is the reputation of how other utilities are getting more credit than they are for their $2.2 billion. So that after a while, as a change agent, you learn how to drop the bomb and say, how come Duke Energy is doing this? Or how come this firm, Exelon, is doing this, and DTE is not, right? So one of the real pleasures of capitalism, or at least working in a capitalist system, is that those who are at the top of the mansion, who control the revenue, who control the people hire, are very concerned about their reputation, and are very concerned about how when their wives or husbands read about a competitor in the newspaper and say, why can Duke do this and you can't? That's a lever of change. So that's the second story I want to tell. And the third lever of change is the shaping of revenue. In a world of sustainability, the license to grow is totally controlled by the throttle of sustainability. If you cannot produce a more efficient car, if you cannot produce more recycled content and flooring, you are not offered access to future revenue, I believe, right? The world has changed so fast that markets require this. So this is the time clock that I use when I'm finally before the top 20 executives of a firm. I say that the reason you need to change is because you're going to go obsolete. So that's the primary reason they'll even stop the clock, right? To enter a world in which you can't sell a gas guzzler, or to enter a world in which you can't sell carpeting without recycled content, or to enter a world in which your products are perceived as shoddy. That's the primary motivator of business behavior, is obsolescence, I believe. Because they're addicted to their products, and they want that addiction to stay, just like a heroin addict. The second thing that I do is what I talked about, reputation, is competitive differentiation. How does the firm, as Woolworths, I find this an interesting case here in Australia, as Woolworths now sells petrol to you all, and is beginning to sell groceries, and is also selling you alcohol, and is now moving into hardware, that is very discernible corporate behavior, right? It's market share dominance type of behavior. The only way to control or influence those things is to think about it in terms of revenue, reputation, reporting, and offer them some solutions that will offer margin improvement. So for example, if I was working for Woolworths now, Woolies, as you say, or their competitor, Coles, I would point out how the stock value of Whole Foods, organic foods in North America, is superior to the stock growth value of classical grocery quality food.
They're already getting into that.
There you go.
But the problem is that they're going to twist it so that it's no longer good food.
You can influence it if you think of it as the fact that this is their license to grow. It's a transformative process, right? And it's always a battle, right? The Walmart effect is to do it to lessen price. But the needs of society are different than the lessening of price. And so it's a battle. You see what I'm saying? That's the way I see it.
And Walmart have changed? Haven't Walmart changed the
Yes.
practices?
Yes.
Recently?
Yes. So for example, if you want to look at Walmart change, put in the word Tyler Elm. He's a friend of mine, and he was one of the key change agents at Walmart. He left Walmart after 10 years, and he's now at Canadian Tire, which is the retail equivalent in Canada. So he's changing Canadian Tire. So there are people like me in all of these firms that are trying to work in this, yeah.
I was just going to say, actually, there's a very strong connection between Woolworths and Walmart. Former CEO, chairman was on the board of Walmart, so they pretty much did whatever Walmart did 5 years later.
Seems to me like a natural pattern. I want to tell you this story, Kate, next. The global market access is real important to these firms, and I think that as sustainability and environmental leaders learn the language of business, they'll realize it's not rocket scientists that are running these businesses. It's people that are very persistent and focused, and you can change them. This is a project that I had nothing to do with, but for me it's a perfect model of what I wanted to convey to you about the possibility of change. I'm coming in for the final 15 minutes of the conversation. When my firm first won the work at Toyota, our first response was some despair, because we said, okay, the car has been the same for 100 years, the regulatory setting is the same, the market conditions are the same. How the hell are we going to change this firm, right? This is an example of radical change, I think, in a more mature industry where there's fewer players. There's fewer people that are capable of making jet components than car components. And yet, this Streamliner series, and I'm happy to say that the strategist who's behind all of this shares my family's last name. But unfortunately, I have no relationship to that Piasecki as far as I can tell. But she got a group and a team together, a team of leaders at Boeing, 20% reduction in fuel consumption, right? Due to some new lighter engines and materials, modern aerodynamics. All these things of design come into play, right? So recently a GE board member told me that they worked with Boeing for 11 years to make this happen, right? So it doesn't happen overnight, but GE was already pushing these component parts, and Boeing was saying yes, right? And there were strategists and change agents pushing for it. 30% reduction in NOx, 60% reduction in noise pollution. And here comes the things that I really believe motivate corporations. In the end, what they wanted was a new type of engine, not for an age of environmentalism, but to get more jets into mid-sized cities, right? So they're changing this vehicle not because they believe in sustainability, but because they want access to different markets and growth, right? So the kind of thing I'm wanting you folks to think about here in Australia is often you have to wear that wolf's clothing to be the sheep of positive change. So if all of this is motivated by Piasecki at this firm for sustainability reasons, the real reasons the P&L people say is that this particular jet will be in more mid-sized cities, which is where the world is going now. We'll have less traffic congestion in the airports. These are practical business reasons as well as end-of-life reasons. And I have found in every case of change of design that I look at, it's going to be a blend of social needs, price parameters, distribution questions, and some quality questions. So again, to reassert what I've said from the start, sustainability is about balancing negativities in people and product. It's about finding a way to newly realign money, people, and rules. So just to say this again, I think that these are the key things: lower cost, reduced risk, growth potential. Those are the things that influence change more than the best intentions, more than moral persuasion, more than the dire facts of how with 7 billion people, we don't have enough water and energy or fuel. So, changing people, processes, and products. So I'm also trying to develop models to share with people in my new book, Doing More with Less. I'm going to show you how we do these leadership exchanges. So we have 10 minutes. I'm going to just give you this presentation for those of you who want it. And then there's some workshops we're doing with multinationals. Just as a joke here, I've tried my best not to talk fast like a New Yorker. Am I talking too fast? Colette, can you believe your dad could talk so slowly?
No, we understand you.
Yeah, and New Yorkers, man, we're fast. You know, we talk like basketball players. So I consciously tried to slow up. So I'm coming in for some concepts about greening processes. I'm going to give you an example of a home, and then I'm going to end with my supercharged superhero, Ben Franklin. By the way, how many of you have heard of Ben Franklin?
Which Ben Franklin?
The American Ben
The
Franklin.
one with bifocals?
The guy with bifocals and lightning, and the guy whose hair the French women wanted to imitate, even though it was pretty pitiful hair. In my new book, Ben Franklin is my supercharged superhero, so I have to end with him. He's the guy who got me to think about frugality and competition is the way to wealth. So I want to end with him, okay? So these are just some of the drivers once you get into the corporate mansion. This is an example of a home, and I think the equivalent in Australia, if you want to be a change agent, would be, is it called bunnies? Bunnies, right? Bunnies. Bunnings. The home appliance place, right? So our Home Depot in America is your firm on steroids, right? And so what I wanted to do is change, in this project, the nature of home products, right? And I'm happy to say that when my daughter and I designed an improvement of my 1760-old home to get my mother-in-law to live in it in a wheelchair, Colette did the tiling in the bathroom, and we used some of these products, Delta products, Masco products. This is a project that we started 10 years ago called Environments for Living. I think it might be very relevant to Australia at this point, because I know that the Australian government has given away some efficient faucets and has given away some efficient lighting, and also had a failed project on photovoltaics at a residential level. This is a very good model of how you can think about the next 15 or 20 years. It's an alliance between all of these companies. Right? I'm going to tell you how self-interest can be manipulated to make positive change. So Shaw Industries was the company I brought in. That's the Warren Buffett firm. They make flooring. This firm makes the insulation of the home. GE does the electronics and the financing of these projects, 130,000 homes so far. I don't have it down here, but there's another company that makes the radiant shield and the roofing called LP, which we also brought in. And the whole idea is to make a home ready for the new future where carbon and energy price volatility matters, right? So the three components in the design that we thought was special, GE wanted to sell dashboards so that when Colette and I are at home, we can know exactly if it's my mother-in-law in the wheelchair, myself, tired from a trip, or Colette that's using all the water. We can know this for sure with great accuracy. We also involve some features of refrigeration for safe food, and it involves gray water systems, all of which are necessary around the world. The good news is it took 7 different organizations to provide homeowners with 20% reduction of electricity cost, 20% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and also some guarantees that they could sell their home in down times more easily. So to sum up, companies are compelled to consider sustainable design in relationship to the impact of their products, the impact of their internal processes, and how their products enable people who buy them to live sustainability. So the bottom line is that in order to capitalize on these new trends I've been talking to you about and position for future growth, we need to think like Ben Franklin all over again. So this is my final attempt. I think Selena said I should speak until about 8:15 and then open it up for 10 minutes of Q&A. What is the salient storyline that sums up the last 35 years of my thinking and career? And I think it's this. When Ben Franklin says in his fantastic essay, I recommend you read it, throw away my books, read this little short essay. It's a beautiful essay he wrote 300 years ago. It's read more than most essays, even more than the Bible and the Quran in some settings. And it shouldn't be read more than those, but it is. And he says, so much for industry, my friends, and attend to one's own business, but to these we must add frugality, if we would make our industry more certainly successful. And I could tell you that the corporation that I built has not had debt for 21 of its 32 years, that we've been profitable every quarter, and that we get to hire who we want, the best lawyers in the world, the best executives, and we also get, on these principles, to choose the projects we want. So I think that we need to become like Ben Franklin all over again. I want to talk about these rules, see if you want to engage me. So I'm going to give you my email. My email is Bruce, B-R-U-C-E, at ahcgroup.com. I'm happy to say that my new book, Doing More with Less, is coming out in Mandarin next year. The Chinese had pirated my 7 prior books, so it's kind of nice to have that advance in my pocket. And they feel, as having contributed 2 billion plus of the 7 billion, that this small American classic matters to them because they know that the Chinese need to become more frugal in their use of materials and energy. That's why today they announced new rules on the use of coal in China, right? Right now, the air particulates in most Chinese cities are 7.2% worse than when I began the Toyota project in non-attainment cities of America. So I predict that we'll be taking this approach to China soon, right? Frugal in time and money, but not cheap, right? If you need the best design engineer, you got to pay for him or her. If you need the best attorney, you have to pay for them. But if it's a good social project, they will come, right? But you need to be frugal in your use of time, respect their use of time, be loyal to them. Franklin was very witty about frugality. It's the opposite of the word cheap. It's a form of respect. It's a form of understanding the human condition. Inventive, and I'm happy to say that most Americans are finally catching on to the fact that we need to be diplomatic instead of warlike. And of the 341 million opinions of America that I track, happy to say that about 61 million of them totally are aligned with these 3 new values. They're called the LOHAS segment of our population. They are not the dominant segment of our population, but it's growing exponentially. I'm sure it's the same in your demographic setting too. Franklin was one of the first global citizens. I got a chance to go to Istanbul a couple months ago, and I asked the taxi driver, I always do this, you know, if I'm going to investigate Enron, I asked the taxi driver what they think of Enron, and one of the chaps said about a month before Enron exploded, I think they're going to explode. I go, how do you know that? He goes, I heard them talking in the back seat. So I asked this chap in Istanbul, did you ever hear of Ben Franklin? And he said in broken English, a Turk, he goes, Ben Franklin, he's our man. If he can't do it, No one can. So I'm thinking in my new book that he's my supercharged superhero, all right, the first global citizen. I thought of him as an American until I started traveling the world. He's actually a global citizen 300 years ago. And I think what Franklin proved to me, that money has no purpose except the purpose of being social. The chance to travel, the chance to learn, the chance to share. And it's important to realize that doing more with less is the mark of success in this century. So I'm open to questions, and hopefully this is the beginning of a dialogue. Hans asked some great questions. Yes, sir.
One of the elements in social innovation in terms of frugality relates, of course, to collaborative consumption, the development of platforms like Airbnb. And one of the necessary conditions for those is trust. And trust has been partly developed through online platforms whereby people can report the success or otherwise of their dealings with individuals, which is in a sense the basis of the success of eBay and Amazon to a degree.
Amazon is an amazing example of that.
So these are the more retailing of the process to what you're describing. I think many of the companies you work for are ones that people don't necessarily see at the consumption end, but they're involved in resources and so on. In terms of this mansion and the reporting that you see is opening the window slightly, do you see any role for the consumer in that, or is this something which ends up being specialised within the company?
Well, great question. I think that we are moving faster towards the age of the citizen consumer than we know. And that in a world in which government is passing rules at a slower pace than the intelligence of the citizen, I think the citizen can shape markets tremendously. Those who were the early adopters of a Prius enabled me to sell Toyota that it should be on the Camry, the quality line, that it should be in the Lexus, the expensive line. They never thought until early consumers bought the Prius that they could justify a $145,000 US car, the Lexus, and a hybrid argument, right? So that the consumer influences markets tremendously by being either an early adopter, a mainstream buyer, or when products fail. So I think that the two things that you said that I want to build on, I think that online purchasing and online behavior is so fast, and it can be swift in a severe way, or it could be swift in a positive way. And I think what's so interesting about the speed of information today is it will do so much good if we learn how to shepherd it. Now, the other thing that you said about trust, I think I want to build on this, and I'm afraid that when I met you, I got the word McKibben in my head, and I didn't get your name, so Kevin. Great question, Kevin. I think that social innovation, I think that the things I spoke about, like social response product development, or the type of dynamics that I speak about within the mansion, is all predicated on the idea that there are many citizen soldiers out there watching in the neighborhood how the mansion operates. Without people in the neighborhood looking in, the corporation of the world will become more medieval, like a castle, and they will widen their moat. If instead you think of it as a skyrise where part of your triumph is to influence them so that you watch who goes up the stairwell, you talk to those who go up the stairwell, you cleanse the windows so that you can see in a little bit more clearly so that they cannot lie as effectively as in the past. Often liability trails or regulatory activity allows you to get information about the needed change. So I think that in addition to trust, there has to be a fair amount of mistrust. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. If a company is giving you greenwash, you have to fight your way through that to find out actual changes in their people and their products. I also wanted to define wealth in a way in which you see how I think about trust, Kevin. I think that humans need bonds, and that what wealth gives us is the chance to create and keep and share wealth, not just the material gains that come from it. And that wealth is the bond that you create in your firm, in your home, in your neighborhood, in your talks, and that it's that bond which enables trust. Now, I hope that everything that I said you don't agree with, but I hope that I bonded with you in the sense that what I want to do is listen to what you have to say and then respond to it in a way that I can. So I think the primary mission of the human exchange is a bonding one in which trust is one of the things that enable us then to have commerce and exchange, right? But the thing that I want to emphasize at this point in my life is that we each play a role in fixing society's woes and problems, and that continues with our family and our friends and in the firm at large. I think that trust is a word that in a legal setting is almost non-existent, right? And so trust in a social innovation setting is critical, right? But there's something in between that we have to pursue, and that's the human bond. We have 7 billion of us in the same boat, right? And the ocean is getting hotter, and there's more salt in the water. And in that situation, we need many things besides trust. We need to understand we're in the same human situation, the same human condition. And trust might be a significant liberator to get to innovation, but I also think other tools like the ones I've tried to share with you are also significant. Sir, you had a question? Okay. Yes, ma'am. Janine?
Yeah, I had a different question, but just to extend that citizen consumer question a little bit more. Is, have you got any good examples? I mean, in Australia, we all, people who are employed by other people, not self-employed, actually pay in 12% of their money to superannuation, so it's enforced money, which actually means that we own Australia corporation.
12%.
Yes.
It's fantastic.
Isn't it?
It's nine.
It's still nine.
It's a type of channelized tax.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
been there for a very long time.
It's fantastic.
The money is invested largely in corporate Australia, so it's not a tax in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Consider it that is, I guess what you're saying. But the reality is that money is invested in Australian corporations, so we actually own Australian corporations. So have you got any good examples of how that power goes beyond citizen consumer, but into, we actually, you know, what are we doing about that ownership? Here's stake shareholder activism is very, very low, despite the fact that this is occurring now. So this has been going, what, how long has compulsory super been? 20 years now? So in fact,
Maybe before I answer, one or two others in the audience should give me a better sense of how they feel about this 9%, because I think it's a very good cultural example of feeling like you can control your destiny a little bit more than, say the poor in America, which I worry about a lot.
The problem is our shareholding is not direct, so the beneficial owner of the shares is the super fund, which is like a 401k, and we're the beneficial owner of a piece of that.
So it's like a tax-deferred annuity in the sense that 9% of your income
It goes into an
is sheltered into a compounded
yeah.
tax deferred. In other words, it's going to grow faster like a pension.
But
Okay.
it's not, the government has privatised the pension fund.
Okay.
For the whole country.
So the first time I thought about that systematically, and I hope this answers your question, is it's very good development that you have this. That in a book I wrote called The Surprising Solution that about a dozen of you now have, there's two chapters in it. One is called Money Matters, and the other is called Money Won't Manage Itself. And for those of you who want it for free, you can just go to worldincbook.com. And it's the first time I tried to think about the power of pension funds in positive change. And so in the American example, and hopefully this can build a bridge to you, because I really don't know enough about the Australian example. In the American example, there is a group called TIA-CREF, the Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, that is larger than any multinational. It's more than $440 billion worth of the pooled monies of all of our teachers, all right? All, people who are public citizens, TIA-CREF. I could tell you, Janine, in most of our environmental debates on corporate change, TIA-CREF is the most influential and the most trusted of the moneyed groups because they're very vigilant in their governance of their stock, right? And so they would do things earlier than others in the history of stock reform. They would prevent investment in South Africa. They would do the types of things that I think are significant in Australia, the Equator Principles, right? So if you look at the American example of TIA-CREF or CalPERS, we work with CalPERS in the California pension group. These are usually leveraged entities that actually care about the improvement of corporate behavior. And they are significant players in the debate. Now, I don't know if in Australia the citizens who run TIA-CREF's equivalent are actually vocal. They are. And they're vocal in how they want to make change. Excellent. That's the lever.
Well, so the members are, but the funds are actually run by mostly banks. So they're essentially amoral.
No, but you can buy socially responsible shares. You actually have got some control. You can decide where you put your money. You don't want your money.
This is great subjects. I'm glad we're talking about this because money matters, believe me.
And I guess that, just following on from your point, those pension funds globally are very proactive and vocal in terms of trying to drive sustainability globally. In terms of, for instance, the UNFFI, which is the financial part of the UN, trying to get pension funds to actually drive that change, whether it's through creating reporting requirements as part of each of the stock exchanges that are globally operating, whether it's, some of them actually got their own guidelines. So we can choose where our money goes.
You can have,
And you can have your own pension fund, but you have to do some research into working out who is actually being, signed up to the responsible investment.
I think that's an accurate description. I'm very happy to hear it from you because it's an example of what is happening in England and in the United States, in Canada. Let me give you another fast forward, and you tell me when I should stop. I will not rest until I help Suncor create $1 billion impact fund. So I want to tell you about where I think the future is going in terms of money. And if I can play a role in helping this oil giant lessen its use of tailing ponds, shouldn't I also be able to guilt them in creating a guilt fund? And that as they transform from oil wealth into future wealth, shouldn't we be able to shape that money so that it isn't only spent on future efforts to get declining oil? So an impact fund, I actually got the ideas from starting to talk with people in London like John Elkington, who wrote the bestseller, The Green Consumer, 30 years ago, and is a very bright man who wrote Cannibals with Forks about corporate behavior. An impact fund, which really right now only exists in theory, slight reality in Norway, where an oil company mostly owned by the pension funds of Norway is structuring an impact fund. But just think of it this way so you could advocate this in the future, and I think I can do it within the next 3 years at Suncor. Because I've watched them go from 17 billion to 43 billion, and 5 years ago I made the argument, if you go from 43 billion to 50, why can't you save one of those to create alternative energy, right? And somehow we're beginning to get traction. But the whole idea is that as wealth is created, and if we know it's about social bonding, shouldn't we reach a point in our machines and financial forecasting where we save some of it not to repeat past mistakes, but we save some of it as a lever, right? So you have to guilt them into thinking this. We're not going to pass laws to tell you to stop this. Instead, we were going to pass laws so that you shepherd the money for the future social value, right? So that's what I'm calling an impact fund. Now, what's beautiful about that is a pension fund, as Kate suggested, is a little difficult to influence because it's so indirect. There's a million intermediaries because they've all pooled their money. But I believe, after writing the book World Inc., that 51 to 53 of the world's largest economies are now corporate. They're not nation states, all right? Google, Walmart, et cetera. Their economies are larger than nation states in most instances, except for maybe 7 nation states. In that reality, you need to create impact funds to create positive change, because it has to do with getting so well inside the corporate mansion that you're getting that mansion to think about its next extension and investing in that extension before it consumes its old place. See what I'm saying? And that's what I now work on. I hope that interests some of you. Any other questions?
Keep the rest of the evening off, Bruce.
All right, thank you, Selena.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Bruce for coming in to speak with us tonight, and doing such a great job with engagement.